This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Well, welcome to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here, and I usually say, along with my guest host Warren Smith, but sitting in for Warren again, and we're glad to have him back as a voice at Breakpoint This Week, is Colson Center writer and thinker extraordinaire Shane Morris. Shane, glad to have you on this week.
Well, I'm glad to be back on, John. You know, the last time Warren had me on, I got texts from family and friends who caught the broadcast, and I got all kinds of mileage out of that, so I'm always eager to be back.
Hey, well, we want to, increase your cool points with your friends and family. That's the real point of this whole engagement is to make ourselves celebrity. Speaking of making ourselves celebrity, let's talk about the hearing that was the feature of the news this week as Robert Mueller finally testified before a congressional panel. Look, there's so many times as we do what we do, Shane, that we go back to Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, and that's all I could think of this week, seeing both the Robert Mueller be brought before this congressional hearing, basically grilled from those on the right and those on the left, and then the ramp up to it and the post-game analysis. I think Postman had an awful lot of things right. But before I get into that, did you watch any of it? What did you think?
So I watched a highlights reel. There were several of them, and some of them were set to classical music, which was pretty darn funny, and interspersed with sort of clips of the president or Democrats denying this or that aspect of Mueller's testimony. So, I mean, that was fun to watch, but in another sense, it was kind of painful to watch. And the fact that so many people were just worked up about it and spent their entire weeks exercised about it makes me wonder if maybe we all ought to just go out, get a little summer sunshine, and repent of our political obsession.
Well, tell us what you really feel. I've kind of had this kind of growing disdain for these kinds of public spectacles because, really, as I heard one commentator, I think this was actually on NPR, it's like, is there really a single person on the planet who in the whole run-up to this didn't take the time to read excerpts or to see highlights or interviews having to do with the Mueller report, and now having watched this 4-hour spectacle, decided, hey, I'm gonna know what I think, and have their hearts and minds changed on this? And the answer is probably not a single person on the planet. And it just came across, on both sides as a political spectacle. And you kind of wonder, this, Mueller seemed far less interested in being there than anybody was interested in him being there, constantly referring back to the report, refusing to answer questions. And that's pretty typical because of what he was warned about. But I guess the grandstanding of basically using this occasion to continue to press things that the report doesn't demonstrate, or to continue to press narratives here and there and everywhere. It kind of goes back, and I just wonder, is it better or worse for the world that we put these things on television? And after the Kavanaugh hearings, for example, after the Gorsuch hearings, and after these, this spectacle, it's far more of a spectacle when these things get put on television than it is any sort of helpful political exercise.
Well, right. I mean, investigations are a good thing. The problem is that word spectacle that you brought up. And I think there's another word that we ought to be thinking about here, and that's gotcha. Both parties were really looking for a gotcha moment here with Mueller's testimony. The Democrats are looking for some hint that he's dropping clues to Congress that they need to go ahead and try to impeach the president for obstruction of justice or something along those lines during the course of the investigation. The Republicans are looking for the opposite. They're looking for complete and total exoneration. That's what the president continues to repeat, despite the fact that Mueller, in his report and in his testimony, explicitly denied that he either exonerated or recommended any sort of prosecution against the president.
Yeah, and one of the things that Neil Postman wrote about in Amusing Ourselves to Death, years and years ago, is that this kind of illusion of being informed is an illusion that kind of takes the place of us actually doing something. And so we're kind of told what to think. We're told how to react. We see these things through the lenses of whatever biases we're bringing into the conversation. And it just doesn't seem, to be something that makes the political discourse better. I don't know. It was just a discouraging thing. And, again, the Democrats saying kind of foolproof that, there was collusion or obstruction, and the other side saying that there's full proof that we've been exonerated. And the report explicitly can't do either one of those things. The mechanism of that office of the special investigator can't do either one of those things. I don't know. It was an extremely frustrating moment. And how can Christians, I mean, on one level we want to be informed, but another level, all of this stuff comes at us through the lens of being entertained to death, or as Postman said, being amused to death, so that even the serious conversations we have are kind of done in this entertainment-driven sort of way. Let's put it on a talking box. Let's have talking heads on both sides, over pontificate on it. Let's do it in a way that makes it seem like this is the most important thing in the world, is what happens at this moment, and to keep you on the edge of the seat and keep you from clicking. It's driven a whole lot more by the need to kind of drive these ratings than it is by helping us move forward as a nation, helping us think through this. I mean, this is the end of a 3-year investigation, and it literally left us no better than when we started.
Yeah, political theater and political amusement, to use Neil Postman's term, it is uniquely based on one emotion, and that's anger. It's intended to gin up partisan anger on both sides. And like you said, there was a foregone conclusion for both Republicans and Democrats in the midst of this entire 3-year investigation. And what was lost in all of that was a love for truth. And I think that's what Christians ought to both focus on going forward and sort of mourn in the aftermath of this whole process.
So the other interesting part of this was there was, I think, a real question whether this sort of hearing, finally getting Mueller in front of Congress, whether that was going to lead to any impeachment hearing. So obviously Mueller walked back and said, look, I can't indict a sitting president for obstruction. There's nothing, not enough here to really prove collusion. But when it comes to obstruction, my hands are off. It's going to be up to Congress whether they want to impeach. And I think we walked out of this pretty sure that, okay, impeachment's not going to happen. But that's what's interesting about that to me is that that's a real divide in the Democratic Party, right? And that's one of the interesting questions, is the divide in the Democratic Party so great? And is this just kind of further divide between the pro-impeachment and the, we're not going to do this, and now one side is won? I mean, how is it possible, for this party to move forward together?
Yeah, I'm like Warren. I have sworn off political prognostication after the surprising election of Donald Trump. But I will say that I think the Democrat who has an issue to run on besides hating Trump is going to run into success in the run-up to 2020. Not just the presidential candidate, whoever gets the nod from the party, but other candidates further down the ballot. So it's going to need to be a little more substantive than that. And I think the Democrats, despite, or rather maybe because of recent history, are a little bit reticent to try to prosecute Trump on procedural grounds. The last president who was impeached on pretty much procedural grounds was Bill Clinton for lying under oath. Obstruction of justice is another sort of procedural crime. They did not get the sort of results they were hoping for from the Mueller investigation, which was proof of collusion with Russia in the 2016 election. So, yeah, the Democrats are going to have to ask themselves those questions. I think Republicans have questions to ask as well. And I think a lot of it does come down to truth and integrity over party affiliation.
Well, it'll be my goal between now and 2020 to get you and Warren to make some predictions of the future, just so I can say, ha, you were both wrong, like we were able to do in 2016, even as I conveniently keep my whole nose out of it. It's such a crazy time. But I think it's more important than ever that Christians both understand what's happening in the political process, but also remember, as Chuck Colson used to often say, salvation's not going to come in Air Force One. You're listening to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here, along with Shane Morris. We'll be right back.
We invite you to visit Breakpoint.org. While you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of great books and other resources. And you can link up to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
Well, we're back on Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here, along with Shane Morris, sitting in this week to talk about the stories of our culture from a Christian worldview. And Shane, I'm hesitant to do 2 whole segments on politics. We try to actually keep it a little bit broader. But there was an interesting conversation that's been started, and I think it's a necessary conversation. You and I had some kind of off-camera back and forth on an event that was held in Washington, D.C. I think it was called the National Conservatism Conference. And I think there's been a feeling for a long time that there is a real crisis in defining what a conservative actually is and actually believes. I think it was the Babylon Bee this week that said, GOP leaders swear that they're going to become fiscally conservative as soon as another Democrat is back in the White House. And you think about what has typically stood for a political conservative and what it is now, and obviously we've had the disruption of what it means from the 2016 candidacy, from the 2016 election. And so there's a real fear that, that the status quo, particularly what was really moving forward in terms of a progressive worldview in politics, that has to be broken, that has to go. And that's really what the election of President Trump has been. But what does it mean really to be a conservative? And I know you kind of watched over the shoulder of this event with a good deal of interest.
Yeah, my friend Brad Littlejohn actually, I think it was in Mere Orthodoxy, wrote a lengthy summary of the whole thing. He runs the Davenant Institute. And he sort of likened the election of Donald Trump to, this earth-shattering natural disaster that left the Republican Party in a sort of post-earthquake state. And in that sort of state, you can have one of two outcomes. You can have a new political and social order that kind of emerges out of it and that's healthy and good and productive and better than what came before, or you can begin to have roving gangs just sort of looting everybody and opportunistically taking what they can. And that seems to be the position we find ourselves in as conservatives prior to the 2020 election. It's sort of, what is the lesson of Donald Trump's election? What are the lessons that we should heed in terms of things we should avoid and things we should gravitate towards? And then who are we? I mean, what does it mean to be a conservative? That's an identity that's kind of been paramount in the Republican Party for a long time. But now there are questions emerging about what conservative means. Does it mean being more of a free market capitalist type who values individual liberty above all else? Or does it mean being more of a classically, Burkean conservative who values family and faith institutions and social organizations and the little platoons and all that sort of thing? So, yeah, there are big questions emerging out of this conference. I'm not entirely convinced that all those questions were answered, but then again, they didn't really set out to do that.
Right, and I think that really the project's a lot harder than we think. I mean, we've said for a long time that when you consider kind of any candidate, you've got three things that you've got to consider. One is policy, and policy is a huge aspect, obviously. What ideas are they going to bring to office? Secondly, character, and character matters, and because more often than not, character is destiny. And then third, company. In other words, who's the team that's going to come alongside of it? And you can see these kind of competing visions of what it means to be conservative just in the company that has been part of this administration. I mean, I've said this a lot. Like, the best part of the presidency of Donald Trump has been a lot of the people that he's placed in positions of influence that have rewritten laws, that have untangled, crazy levels of bureaucratic red tape in setting and resetting rules. And it's, and he hasn't, that hasn't delivered on 100%, but there's some real kind of diehard conservatives in the same way that I would understand the importance, for example, of social conservatism. I think that's why we've seen so much movement on the pro-life issue, for example, in so many ways. On the other hand, kind of the worst thing about the president has been other company that he surrounded himself with. And that's kind of been one of the things that has been this kind of repeated cause of trouble, whether we're talking about, former lawyers, former campaign managers, or whatever. And it just goes to show. And there also, by the way, seems to be a kind of a competing vision of what it means to be a conservative right now. It's interesting, for example, to me, to hear so many conservatives, and this was actually one of the topics of the conference that you were thinking about, to really have real questions about government interference in big business. There's certainly a level of sympathy that we have when it comes to big businesses being able to kind of set cultural agendas for everybody else, disenfranchising certain customers. They can get away, for example, for deprioritizing Twitter and Facebook and so on, can get in trouble, can get away with deprioritizing certain messaging that they don't like, a lot of times from Christians or conservatives and so on. And so then does the government belong in that space? Well, we have conservatives saying that, the government needs to step in and kind of balance the playing field. But that's kind of the exact opposite of what conservatives have often thought in terms of what it means to be a fiscal conservative.
Right. So cards on the table. I'm sort of more of a libertarian-ish, classical liberal type. So I'm really big on the economic freedom thing. I think some of these critiques definitely land home. I think others are a little bit passé. We've heard them before. We've tried them before. For instance, protectionism, tariffs are nothing new. But I think it was Missouri Senator Josh Hawley and his speech at the conference that really pegged the mood of the whole thing and why it is we have a gathering of conservatives who sort of identify across the spectrum of conservative and classically liberal thinking, saying we need something new. He says, the left champions multiculturalism and degrades our common identity. The right celebrates hyper-globalization and promises that the market will make everything right in the end, eventually, perhaps. And that's that nod to big corporations who are, kind of trying to shut down traditional views. But he goes on, but the old political platforms have grown stale, and the old political truisms now ring hollow. The American people are demanding something different and something better. And I guess the goal of the National Conservatism Conference and the events being planned in its wake is to figure out what is that something better, and what is the solution to the deficiencies that are perceived in the old way of doing things, the sort of Bush-era, Reagan-era way.
Right, but these are huge, huge questions, and I think that there's a point to what Senator Hawley is saying, and just in terms of it's a new world. So what I agree with you. I kind of almost always think that when the government steps in to almost anything, it's a bad idea, and it's probably just because I fly so much and I have this this thing about security. I just have lived through that whole thing. But
oh no, don't let's get on your TSA hobby horse. We know how that goes.
Listen, TSA is the worst thing that the government does, but. And our listeners know. Yeah. But look, I almost think it's always bad for the government to step in. But we also do have an era of big business behaving badly. And what is the answer? And I think you do have some conservatives that want to suggest that the answer is, well, we need more government. I think, well, that's not conservative at all historically, but we can't expect in a culture that is not only fiddled around with immorality, but has completely flipped upside down what is moral and what's immoral, what's good and what's bad, than to think that, for example, the market will sort it all out. I mean, the market sorts it all out in a culture where there's, I think, at least some vestiges of a traditional understanding of what's right and wrong. But when what's right is wrong and what's wrong is right, that sort of economic freedom, can that actually deliver what we expect, let the market sort it out. I mean, I would have said that up until 5 or 6 years ago. To me, this is a real question, though, here's where you and I know I agree, which is a much better solution to me is the rebuilding of mediating institutions. In other words, the government's not going to fix it. The market's not going to fix it. We're going to need the church to step back in and have some sort of influence in society through mediating institutions so we can have some semblance of normality and sanity when it comes to what's right and wrong.
Right. There's a huge chicken and egg question here that's unspoken. It seems like the assumption going into the National Conservatism Conference for many was that the free market economy and all of this laissez-faire attitude since the Reagan administration has been responsible for the breakdown of mediating institutions. Rather, I think it's probably the opposite, that the mediating institutions have broken down through ascendant ideologies of various kind, the sexual revolution being the obvious suspect, and then the market has rushed in to do something that it really is not equipped to do. And nobody who really believes in free market economics thinks that the market is equipped to replace the family or the church or any of that. It needs to exist with those things, alongside those things. And so you have to wonder, is introducing some new tariffs, to help middle America going to address the fundamental problems that have resulted in family breakdown and the opiate crisis and all of these things that so many of these conservative writers so rightly focus on?
Yeah, and I think we're at a place where the current conservative political movement is really utilitarian. Why tariffs? Because they're going to work in the short term. It's a risky strategy, but it's, I don't think anybody thinks that they're a long-term strategy. It's a short-term strategy to rebalance the playing field. And that's that, if you want something that defines the president's administration and the way that he works, it's very utilitarian. And I think the conversation we need to have is a little bit beyond that, which, okay, maybe this is a disruptive presidency and it's going to reset the playing field in this way or that way. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But is there a long-term vision of what it means to be a political conservative? And I think for Christians, then we got to have that secondary conversation, which is, where does being a Christian fit into being this? And that, of course, is a much more difficult conversation. So given that can of worms, let's open it, spread it around the ground, and we'll move to our next segment. You're listening to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here with Shane Morris. We'll be right back.
You can learn more about Breakpoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
Well, we're back on Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Shane, I saw a bunch of tweets this week and with a bunch of conservatives going, I never thought I'd see the day where I agree with Peter Singer. We've talked before on Breakpoint at the Colson Center about how now that the T and the Q have joined the acronym, that there's kind of an emerging world of strange alliances. In what world would, the president of Concerned Women for America, Penny Nance, and the president of a group called the Women's Liberation Front join together to write an op-ed and partner together? And yet that's what we're seeing. And the occasion of Peter Singer, now for folks who don't know, Peter Singer is a notorious atheist who really pushes the line on bioethics. So he is suggested famously not only that abortion should be legal, but so should infanticide, that parents should have the right to kill their children up to 18 months. I think it was 18 months. I've heard different numbers on that. He's famously said that a fully healthy pig could be more valuable than a disabled child. I mean, as far as worldview goes, we couldn't be further apart. And yet he joined a group of academics this week to basically question the inability to question the transgender ideology in higher academics. And what you have is that it's a really quick way to get fired. They're called turf wars, where many professors that are kind of old school, radical feminists are finding themselves on the wrong side of political correctness because they're saying as women, men can't understand women's experience. Now you have the transgender ideology basically saying that men can appropriate women and their experiences and so on, and they're saying this is wrong, and they get accused of being a bigot. So you have a group of academics, Peter Singer being one of them, saying, look, we need to have an academic debate on this. We can't just silence people who don't go along with a transgender ideology. It was a fascinating development because we've seen so many people unwilling to resist at all. It seems to me that there's some these strange alliances are going to become more and more common.
Yeah, for those who don't know, TERF, T-E-R-F, it stands for Trans-Exclusionary Radical Feminist. And the idea, folks like Camille Paglia are sort of at the head of this movement. And the idea is that these are feminists who believe that feminism is for women, that feminism was founded on the basis of protecting women's equal rights alongside men's. And the problem with that is the transgender movement is making a very radical claim that men can become women. The problem is men obviously can't become women. So the result of this, how it plays out, is that men end up intruding on spaces where they then displace women. So women really don't get a good deal out of the transgender movement. They no longer get bathrooms to themselves. They no longer get to compete in single-sex sporting leagues. And increasingly, they even have to cater to the whims of very disturbed men who think they have a right to live and be treated as women. And the so-called TERFs, who most feminists want to exclude, are crying foul. They're saying this is not okay. And Peter Singer apparently is joining them now.
Yeah, it's a fascinating reality, and look, I feel like we talk about this topic way too much, just because it's so dominant. You can attest that at our editorial conversations, I'm like, can we please talk about something other than the transgender issue? But it's so dominant, and there's such a sense of entitlement, to demand so many things. But you brought up something that I think is really important, that women are getting short end of the stick here. This has kind of been the story of the sexual revolution, like promise, progressive vision of women's rights and freedom and so on and so on and so on. But the fruit that comes back keeps being anti-woman in one form or another.
We talked recently on Breakpoint about how abortion has actually been bad for women, how it's enabled a sense of male irresponsibility, that you don't have to man up anymore and actually take responsibility for the consequences of your actions, which in many cases actually includes children. You don't have to take care of those who are overwhelmingly, disproportionately affected by your actions, and that is women. You can just sort of drop a couple $100 and tell them to, go get it taken care of. So this idea that the sexual revolution in its most extreme forms, which transgenderism is an extreme form, has been good for women or has served women, it's causing a lot of women to raise their eyebrows, progressive women who say, hang on, you know what, why is it that we are always the ones that have to give something up in the name of this new ideology that men can be whatever sex or gender they want to be.
Look, I'm just glad that a group of academics have stood up, because academia is one of those areas where, look, you can be dismissed, you can be silenced, you can be hushed, you can be shamed. And this is one of those issues by which you can do it. So for this group of academics basically to resist this call to conform or else is really interesting to watch. Well, we're out of time for today. You've been listening to Breakpoint this week. I'm John Stonestreet, joined today by Shane Morris. Come to breakpoint.org. Click on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll link you to various Breakpoint commentaries, articles, and other things that we have found that mention or help you understand the various topics of today's program a little bit better. And don't miss the opportunity to sign up for our next short course. Our short courses are 4-week-long explorations, deep dives on specific areas of culture that can be interesting. I think our next short course is dealing with some of the big, tough questions of our culture, including the issue of #MeToo and racism and transgenderism, and how do we think about all of these things through a Christian worldview. Again, the website is breakpoint.org. And don't miss a single episode of the Breakpoint podcast. Wherever you get your podcast, just look for the Breakpoint podcast, and you can catch all of our daily commentaries as well as our weekly conversations. Shane, it's great to have you today on Breakpoint this week. We'll have you back again soon, and thanks everybody for joining us.